Hello, and welcome back. Whether you're here for the first time tonight or you've been with us before, I'm so glad you're here. I'm Mr. Dantello, and we've got something special lined up for you. Tonight, we're exploring the territory of ghosts and haunted places. Those spaces where the past seems to linger, where the walls themselves might hold on to what came before. It's a theme that speaks to something in all of us, I think. The uncanny feeling of being somewhere that remembers more than we do. We have 5 stories for you tonight, and each one approaches that unsettling intersection between home and something far stranger. Our first story is called The Walls Remember Tenants from Before the House Was Built, a meditation on what structures might know about their own history. Then we move to I Keep Finding Dinner Set for Someone Who Left Decades Ago, the quiet, persistent unease of routines that shouldn't still be happening. The third takes a different turn. The hallway photograph showrooms that disappeared last week, where evidence of the impossible starts appearing in ordinary places. From there, we have my inherited bedroom door opens to someone else's childhood, a story about inheritance that goes far deeper than furniture and documents. And we'll close with the floorboards creak in footsteps I've never made. The intimacy of hearing something walk through your own space. If you've enjoyed what we do here, it truly means the world to us if you like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now, get yourself comfortable. Settle in somewhere warm, dim the lights if you can, and just let yourself drift with us for a while. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The Walls Remember Tenants from Before the House Was Built. The master bedroom gets morning light that turns the dust visible, and I've been standing in it for longer than makes sense, watching particles move through the gold-colored air like they're alive. That's what I keep doing now. Standing, noticing things, the kind of thing people do when they're alone in a house that isn't theirs yet, not quite, even though the deed is in my name and has been for 8 weeks. My grandmother's house. Victorian, 1887 according to the county records, though the realtor said 1882 and my cousin said 1890. And none of it matters anymore, because she's gone and the house is full of her things, and I'm here to make it empty and saleable. That's the job. That's why I'm not selling it furnished. That's why I've been gutting the rooms systematically, starting upstairs, working my way down like an archaeologist who knows exactly what century she's looking for. This bedroom was hers, master bedroom, though she slept in the smaller room across the hall for the last 15 years of her life. I don't know why. The house was large enough. Maybe the master felt too formal for just one person. Maybe she couldn't stand the silence here. I can. The walls are original plaster, the kind that has actual texture, not the smooth drywall coating of newer homes, but genuine hand-finished surface, yellowed and cracked in patterns that probably mean something to someone who knows old houses. The wallpaper was floral once, still is in places. Cabbage roses, I think, or peonies in a pattern so faded the colors have gone the color of old teeth. It's peeling in strips along the north wall, curling away from the plaster like skin that's been sunburned too long ago to heal. Behind some of those peels, I can see older paper. Purple, even older than that, maybe cream-colored. The walls have memory. I'm holding a clipboard because I'm inventorying everything. That's the practical approach. The thing that lets me feel like I'm in control of this process, and I've written down, master bedroom. East-facing windows, original plaster, original floors. Floral paper peeling requires plasterwork, wall prep, possible removal to studs. That last part is a guess. I haven't done construction before. I'm an accountant. I look at numbers that don't argue, that stay put, that mean the same thing on Tuesday that they meant on Monday. Walls are harder. Walls have opinions. Walls can surprise you. The window is tall and narrow, the kind of Victorian window that looks elegant from outside and lets in far too much light from inside. The glass is original, I can tell because of the slight waviness of the surface. The old imperfections that newer panes don't have. You can see the garden through it, or what used to be a garden. Now it's just an arrangement of overgrown things, shrubs that have gone tall and shapeless, bushes that forgot what they were planted for, grass that becomes weeds the moment you stop paying attention to which is which. I don't know what was out there when my grandmother was younger. I don't know if it was beautiful, if it was her project, or someone else's. If it was something she loved enough to maintain for a while and then let go. The room is cold. That's the first thing people notice about old houses, the way they stay cold regardless of the season. It's only September, early morning September, so cold is almost appropriate. But there's cold, and then there's cold. This is the kind that sits in the corners and doesn't leave. The kind that makes you want to hunch your shoulders even before you feel it. My breath isn't visible yet. It's not cold enough for that, but I can feel the quality of the air. Dense, still, like it's been waiting for something. I write on the clipboard, check vac. I won't check vac. Vac is not my job. But I write it anyway, because it makes me feel less alone to pretend I have a plan. To pretend I'm not just wandering through this house like a ghost pretending to be living. There's a closet in the master bedroom. Deep and dark and empty now, though it smells like old wood and the kind of mustiness that takes decades to accumulate. My grandmother's clothes have been donated. The boxes have been removed. What remains is just the space itself, the shape of where things used to be hung. I walk to the closet. This is the kind of thing I do. I walk to spaces and stand in them. I read the walls like they're supposed to mean something to me. That's when I notice it. High up on the back wall of the closet, where the darkness is thickest, there's a word carved into the wood. Not scratched, not written. Carved, deliberate, careful, deep enough that even in the near dark I can trace it with my eyes. Samuel, just the name, no date, no context, just the name of someone from some time, carved into the wood of my grandmother's closet, small and final and completely, utterly wrong. I step back. I don't know why I step back. It's just a name. People carve names into things. People always have. Kids in school desks, young people on trees, prisoners on cell walls. It's what people do when they want to say, I was here. I existed. Someone should remember me. But the handwriting is old. That's what unsettles me. Not just the fact of it, the character of it. The hand that carved it was careful and small. And it might have been holding something sharp with that kind of purposeful grip that means it took time. That means someone stood in this closet and carved a name into the wood and believed it mattered. I take a photograph with my phone. For the documentation. For the record. That's what I tell myself. I'm documenting the house as is. Inventory, professional, practical. The light from the window is still gold-colored, still full of moving dust, still utterly indifferent to the fact that I've just found the name of a stranger written into my grandmother's house. I leave the closet. I walk back into the main room. I keep the clipboard with me like it's proof of something. The master bedroom is still just a room. High ceilings. Original plaster. East-facing windows. But now it's not empty anymore. Now it has a name in it. A voice, sort of. A claim. Samuel, I don't write it down. I should. But instead I just stand there in the gold light and try to remember if I've ever heard my grandmother mention that name, and I can't. I can't imagine anyone with a name like that being part of her life. It's too old to sound. Too deliberate. I turn back to face the closet. The darkness is still thick there. The name is still carved. I've been in this house for 3 weeks now, working during the day, sleeping in the guest room, planning the renovations that will make this place into something modern and saleable. 3 weeks, and I've never noticed. How long was it there before that? How long before my grandmother? How long does a name have to be carved into wood before it becomes part of the walls themselves? I make a note on my phone. Closet, back wall. Carved initials. Remove or refinish. Then I leave the bedroom and close the door, and I try very hard not to think about the quality of the silence that follows me down the hallway. The floorboards in that hallway have always been uneven. I know this. I've walked them 100 times in the 3 weeks I've been staying here. They creak in predictable places. The fourth plank from the stairs, the section near the bathroom, the long straightaway before the guest room. It's a conversation the house has with itself. Old wood settling. Thermal expansion. Nothing unusual. But that night, after I've photographed the carving and made my note and closed the bedroom door, I hear something new in the pattern. I'm downstairs at the kitchen table, working through the contractor estimates when I first notice it. A sound from above, not the casual settling I've grown accustomed to, but rhythmic, deliberate, step, pause, as if someone is walking through the hallway with exaggerated care, testing each board before committing their weight to it. I stop reading. I listen. The house is old and full of sounds, especially in the evening when the temperature drops and the wood contracts. This is something I've learned. But this particular sound, it has a quality I can't quite name. Intention. That's the closest word. It sounds like a person learning the floorboards, relearning them. The sound stops. I pour myself more coffee even though it's almost 9 at night. I open my phone and look at the photograph I took. The carving is blurry in the harsh phone light, but the letters are still legible. Samuel. A Name someone cared enough about to spend time with, in the privacy of a closet, in the dark of a house that wasn't mine. I don't sleep well. The guest room is small, my grandmother's sewing room actually, and it's filled with the faint smell of old fabric and mothballs that I haven't quite managed to air out. I lie in the narrow bed and listen to the house. It has 1,000 sounds at night. Creaking, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, wind in the eaves. Once around 2 in the morning, I hear what sounds distinctly like footsteps on the main stairs, slow and careful, but when I get up and look, there's nothing. No one. The stairs are dark and empty. I tell myself I was half asleep. Dreams bleed into waking in old houses. The mind fills in what it expects to hear. The next morning, I'm in the kitchen making breakfast when I notice something in the hallway. A window seat I'd somehow overlooked, a built-in bench with old cushions, the kind of place my grandmother might have sat to read on winter afternoons. The lid is open. It's been closed every other day I've been here. I'm certain of this. I've walked past it 12 times. The interior is full of old fabric scraps and loose batting. Quilting materials, probably, but underneath, when I lift some of the material, I find something else. A piece of lined paper. Old paper. The kind that's yellowed and brittle and has been folded small. My hands are shaking when I open it, which is stupid. It's just paper. The writing is the same as the carving. Same careful script. Same purposeful hand. It reads, "There's someone in the walls, not the spaces between them, in them." Can you hear? I carved my name so I wouldn't forget, so someone would know I was here. I dropped the paper on the window seat. I step back. I need air suddenly. I move to the kitchen, to the window above the sink, and I stare out at the morning, the overgrown garden, the neighbor's fence. The utterly normal world continuing on without acknowledgement of what I've just found in my house. The paper, the writing, the identical hand. There are explanations. There have to be. My grandmother was an elderly woman. She lived alone in this house for 40 years after my grandfather died. People deteriorate. People write odd things. People leave cryptic notes. It's not unusual, not impossible. But I keep thinking about the floorboards, the careful, testing rhythm of something learning the hallway. I spend the rest of the morning on my laptop in the library section of the town's website, pulling property records. The house was built in 1887. My grandmother purchased it in 1962. That leaves 75 years of other people, other families, other histories I know nothing about. I write down names as they appear in the records, the Hendersons, 1954, 1962. The Kowalskis before that. Going back further, I find deed transfers and legal documents, but the names start to blur together. Decades of them. Centuries of them almost, all of these people walking through the same hallway I walked this morning. All of them living in rooms I'm standing in. All of them leaving, eventually, and forgetting. Except someone didn't forget. Someone was careful enough to carve a name into wood. Careful enough to leave a message inside a window seat. That afternoon, I call a local historian, a woman named Rebecca, who works at the Historical Society. I don't tell her everything. I tell her I'm doing renovation work on a property, and I'm curious about the history. She's delighted. She loves these conversations. I can hear it in her voice. She pulls records and reads them to me over the phone. 1788 for the original structure, she says, though there were additions in the 1800s. The Hendersons did some work in the 50s, but most of the original character is intact. It's a beautiful house. You're lucky. I'm not sure lucky is the right word. Did you happen to notice anything unusual? I ask. About the previous owners? Any families that didn't stay long? Any incidents? She pauses. I can hear her typing in the background. Not that I'm aware of. Why do you ask? I choose my words carefully. I'm finding marks. In the woodwork. Carved, it might just be something from years of families. But I'm trying to establish a timeline. Oh, she sounds interested now. That's not uncommon in old homes. Could be anything. Children playing. People leaving their mark. It's actually historically interesting. A kind of folk record of occupation. Do you want to bring the item by some time? I might be able to help date it. Sometimes the tool marks can tell you a lot. I don't want to bring it anywhere. I want the conversation to end. But I thank her and say I'll call back if I need her, and we exchange pleasantries before hanging up. The problem is that it doesn't feel like folk record. It doesn't feel like a child's carving. It feels like someone leaving evidence, someone afraid of being forgotten. That night I make sure all the doors are locked. I don't know why this matters. Whoever left the note is long gone, but it helps me sleep a little. Almost helps. I'm in bed around 10 reading on my phone when I hear the hallway sound again. The careful footsteps. The testing of each board. This time I check the clock. 10:47 p.m. This time I try to count the steps. I make it to 16 before they stop. I lie in the dark and wait for them to continue. But they don't. The silence is complete. The kind of silence that feels deliberate. By the fourth day of hearing the sounds, always around the same time, always the same careful rhythm, I've moved past fear into something else. Curiosity, maybe, or resignation. The house has a pattern now, and I'm learning it like I learned the creaking of the floorboards. I begin leaving things as a kind of test. In the morning, I place a pencil on the kitchen counter, perpendicular to the edge. By evening, it's been moved. A few inches to the left. I move it back. The next day, it's moved again, in a different direction. I know how this sounds. I know there are explanations. The wind from an open window, the vibration of heavy trucks passing on the road, the settling of the kitchen floor. But I've checked the windows. I've watched the road. And each movement is too precise, too deliberate, too much like a response. I start a notebook. I write down what I find and when I find it. The pencil, a door in the master bedroom that I leave open, which is closed by evening. The lights, I've turned off the hallway light one night and found it on the next morning, which could be my own error, could be my own confusion about which switches control which lights in a house that doesn't quite follow logic. The carving in the closet is still there. I visit it sometimes. I trace the letters with my finger. Samuel, someone's actual name. Someone's claim on this house that predates my grandmother by some unknown amount of time. On the fifth day, I find something new. In the library, the room I've been using for work, on the shelf with my grandmother's old books, there's a journal. It's leather-bound, old enough to be brittle, and on the first page, in careful script, it says, "This house keeps its tenants. This house remembers. This house does not let go." Below that, a date, 1923. And below that, a name, Samuel. The writing is different from the carving, more fluid, less desperate, but it's the same hand, the same person. Samuel wrote this more than 100 years ago, and I'm now holding the evidence of it in my hands, in a room that no longer smells like just my grandmother's life, but like layers of lives, all of them pressed between the walls, all of them refusing to leave. The footsteps in the hallway continue that night, but this time I don't hide in the guest room. This time I sit at the kitchen table with the journal in front of me and the lights on and the front door locked, and I listen to the sound of someone coming home. I don't sleep anymore, not the way I did before. I exist in the house now in a state somewhere between waking and something else entirely. My days blur into the routine of small observations. The notebook fills with entries I barely remember writing. The journal sits open on the kitchen table, and I've begun reading Samuel's words in chronological order, piecing together a history that feels increasingly like a warning. The entries span decades. Samuel moved into this house in 1921 as a groundskeeper. He married someone named Margaret in 1924. There are long gaps where nothing is written. Then in 1947, a single line, "Margaret does not remember leaving the parlor," says she was there all evening, but I watched her walk into it at dusk. At midnight, she was in our bed. She does not remember the hours between. I read this while sitting perfectly still at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., and something in my chest goes very cold. The entries after that become sparse. The handwriting deteriorates. There are words crossed out so violently they've torn through the paper. In 1956, Samuel writes, "The house shows you what you've already lost. It doesn't take anything new. It only reminds you it was never truly yours to begin with." Margaret understands this now. I wish she didn't. The last entry is dated November 3rd, 1962. I leave tomorrow. I should have left 50 years ago. But the house won't let me write that I'm leaving. So I'll write this instead. If you're reading this, you've already decided to stay. The house only keeps those who choose it, again and again, even when they don't know that's what they're doing. That's where the journal ends. Blank pages follow. Dozens of them. I close the book. My hands are shaking. On the 6th day, I call someone I haven't spoken to in years, my cousin Drew, who lives 3 hours away and is the only family member I could contact without raising questions. I don't mention the journal or the sounds. I ask, carefully, if they remember anything about my grandmother living with anyone else in this house, any mention of other residents, other people who might have lived here. Drew is quiet for a long time. Then they say she never mentioned anyone. But she didn't like to talk about the house much. I remember my parents asking her once why she kept the place when it was so old and needed so much work. She got very quiet. She said some houses choose their people, and you either live with that or you move and spend the rest of your life wondering what you left behind. After I hang up, I sit in the silence of the kitchen and understand that my grandmother knew. She had always known. That night the footsteps don't come at their usual time. Instead, around 9 p.m., I hear something else. Something worse. It's the sound of someone breathing, not in the hallway, in the room with me. I'm in the library, sitting in the leather armchair where I've been spending my evenings, reading through old notebooks when the sound registers. It's very faint. It's very close. It's the unmistakable rhythm of a person breathing in the dark. I don't move. I don't turn on the light. I sit absolutely still and listen, and the breathing continues, and it's not my own. I'm holding my breath, I realize. I've been holding my breath for so long my lungs are burning. But the breathing continues. Someone else's lungs. Someone else's air moving in and out in the space where I am. When I finally turn on the lamp, there's nothing there. The room is empty. The breathing stops. But I can smell it now. Something like old fabric. Something like the inside of a closed room that hasn't been opened in a very long time. I leave the library. I go to the kitchen. I lock myself in with all the lights on, and I wait for dawn. The smell follows me. On the 7th day, I begin to question what I've been experiencing. Stress can do things to the mind. Isolation can make you imaginative. A new house, old stories, a name carved into closet wood, these are seeds for paranoia. I know the psychology. I've read enough to understand how easily the mind constructs meaning from nothing, how it finds patterns in randomness, how it transforms an old house's natural sounds into something intentional, something personal, something directed at you specifically. So I decide to leave. I pack a bag in the afternoon. I'll go stay with Drew. I'll get distance. I'll let the mind settle. I'll come back to this with clarity. By 8 p.m., I'm ready. The car is loaded. The house is dark, except for the front porch light, which I've left on. I do a final walkthrough. It feels important to close this chapter cleanly, to not leave things undone. I'm in the hallway on my way to the front door when I see it. The hallway mirror, a large, ornate thing that's been there since my grandmother's time, is fogged. Not from moisture. The fog has a pattern. It's thick in some places, thin in others. It looks almost like breath has been deliberately drawn across the surface, and I'm close enough now to see that there's something written in it. One word, spelled out in the condensation. Stay, I watch as I'm standing there, breath coming fast, and the letter S trembles slightly. The T follows, the A, the Y. It's not settling or evaporating naturally. It's being traced by something I cannot see, and I can hear the faint sound of fingernails on glass, the sound of someone touching the mirror from the other side. The sound of. I don't stay to watch it finish. I leave the house. I'm in my car and driving away within minutes, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if something might follow. But nothing follows. The drive to Drew's is empty and ordinary. Highway lights and empty road. By the time I arrive, I've almost convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Almost, Drew lets me in without questions. I shower. I sleep in their guest room and sleep harder than I have in weeks. But I dream of breathing that isn't my own, and hallways that extend in directions that shouldn't be possible, and a house that's standing in the dark, patient and ancient and waiting. On the 9th day, 2 days after I left, I drive back. I don't know why. I tell myself I'm checking on things, locking up properly, making sure nothing is damaged. But as I pull into the driveway, I know the truth. I'm coming home. The house looks the same. Calm, ordinary, the door opens easily when I turn the key, and the air inside is cool and still and so familiar now it feels like breathing. I find the journal still on the kitchen table. I find the pencil where I left it, perpendicular to the edge of the counter exactly as it was. And I find on the blank pages at the back of the journal a single new entry. The handwriting isn't Samuel's. It isn't mine. It's something in between. A script that seems to shift between one style and another as your eyes move across the page. The entry is dated today. It reads, "You came back. You knew you would. The house doesn't take anything. It only teaches you that you never really left at all. Welcome home." I sit at the kitchen table with the journal in my hands, and I listen to the house settle around me. Somewhere upstairs, in the hallway I know so well, I hear the careful footsteps beginning their nightly walk. The testing of each board. The slow, deliberate progress toward something or away from something, I no longer know which. This time, I don't hide. This time, I count the steps and wait for them to reach me. This time, I'm ready to understand what it means to stay. The footsteps never reached me that night. They stopped somewhere on the landing. I counted 63 steps before the silence returned, complete and absolute. I sat at the kitchen table for another hour, waiting for something I couldn't name. Eventually, I went upstairs to bed. The house felt different now, not hostile. Inhabited the way a space feels when you stop being alone in it. I don't know how long I stayed awake listening to the ordinary sounds of the building, the settling of wood, the whisper of wind finding its way through frames I'd never noticed were imperfect. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, sounds that had always been there, probably that I'd simply never truly heard before. Sounds that meant something now, because I understood that I was sharing the space with something else. Something patient. Something that had already decided I belonged here. In the morning, the journal had changed again. The new entry was shorter. Written in that same shifting script, it said only, "You understand now." That's enough. The ink was fresh. I could smell it, that thin chemical scent of ballpoint pressing into paper. I ran my fingertip across the words, half expecting to feel the ink still wet, but it had dried hours ago. Hours before I woke. Hours before dawn. I called Drew and told them I was staying. I said the pipes needed attention and the roof required inspection, which was partially true. I didn't mention the journal. I didn't mention the message in the mirror or the footsteps I'd been counting or the way the house had begun to feel less like a place I inhabited and more like a place that inhabited me. Drew accepted this without argument, which I appreciated. Over the next week, I settled into a routine that felt both new and ancient. I woke at 7. I made coffee in the kitchen, using the same mug, A blue one with a chip on the rim, the kind of thing you don't replace because you've grown used to the feel of it against your mouth. I took my coffee to the living room and sat in Samuel's chair, which I'd never sat in before, but which felt right to sit in now. The leather had molded itself to a shape that wasn't quite mine, but was learning to be. I cleaned the house methodically, not because it was dirty, it wasn't, but because the act of cleaning, of moving through the rooms with purpose and intention, felt important. It felt like I was claiming the space even as I acknowledged that the space had already claimed me. I washed the hallway mirror. When the condensation came back, and it did, every morning, though never thick enough to write in, I simply wiped it away before anything could form. The journal remained on the kitchen table. I didn't write in it. I didn't touch it except to dust the surface it rested on. But I read it every evening, going back through all the entries. Samuel's careful notation of household repairs and expense. The blank pages in the middle where he must have stopped writing. And then the entries that weren't his, the ones that had come after, in that handwriting that seemed to flicker between mine and something else entirely. They read like a conversation, I realized. A conversation between the house and whoever lived in it. A conversation that had been waiting a very long time for a participant willing to listen rather than run. On the 12th day, I returned to the sealed room in the basement. I don't remember consciously deciding to do it. I found myself at the basement door, key in hand, that old iron key I'd found in the drawer months ago, the one I'd never used. The lock turned easily. I'd oiled it without thinking about it, sometime during my cleaning phase. The door swung open on hinges that made no sound. The room was smaller than I'd imagined. A narrow space, more a closet than a room, though the doorframe suggested it had once been something else. The walls were rough stone, older than the rest of the house. There was dust, thick and undisturbed, and the smell of earth and time. On a shelf, simple wood warped with ages at a few objects. A wooden box, the kind jewelry used to come in. Several books with water-damaged spines. A photograph in a frame so tarnished the glass was almost opaque. I didn't touch anything. I stood in the doorway and looked at what had been preserved there, what someone had chosen to keep locked away, and I understood that this was not for me to open. Not yet. Not now. Perhaps not ever. I closed the door. I locked it again. I put the key back in the drawer. By the 3rd week, the house had become simply my home. The strangeness didn't fade, but it integrated. The way you might live in a city long enough that the sirens stop being alarming, you begin to understand their patterns, to expect them, to build your life around the rhythm of their arrival and departure. I found myself doing things without deciding to do them, taking a different route through the kitchen, avoiding the 3rd step on the basement stairs, though I couldn't have said why, leaving lights on in certain rooms, not out of necessity, but because the house seemed to prefer it. I began to recognize the creaks and groans as a kind of language, not speech exactly, but communication, the settling of something old and extensive, acknowledging my presence, marking my time. The footsteps in the hallway became a thing I anticipated. They came, usually around 2 in the morning, sometimes later. I stopped counting after the first week. I would lie in bed and listen to them pass my door, slower now, less deliberate, as if we were becoming accustomed to each other. Once, I got up and opened the door while they were happening. The hallway was empty, but I could feel the movement in the air like a wind that came from nowhere, and the steps seemed to pause as I stood there, as if they too were registering my presence, acknowledging that something had changed. I didn't close the door. I stood in the opening and waited until the sensation passed, until the hallway felt neutral again, until whatever had been moving through it had moved on. Then I went back to bed. Letters began arriving addressed to Samuel. Bills, mostly, an official notice about property taxes, a postcard from someone named Alex sent from somewhere coastal saying, "Thinking of you. Hope the place is treating you well." It always treated me well. That postcard I kept. I placed it on the shelf above the fireplace, next to a candlestick Samuel must have valued enough to keep all these years. I didn't open the bills. I set them in a drawer and assumed the responsibility would eventually require my attention. It didn't seem pressing. The house provided for itself. Somehow, the light stayed on without my paying attention to the electric bill. The heat continued through the autumn as the weather shifted. There was food in the pantry, things I didn't remember buying, though I must have. The house and I were learning to live together. Drew called less frequently. I told them I was fine, that I was staying through the winter, that I'd decided to keep the house. They seemed unsurprised, which made me wonder if something about my voice, even over the phone, had announced this decision before I'd made it consciously. Drew didn't argue. Drew knew, somehow, that I wasn't coming back to my old life. Even if I occasionally left the house to buy groceries or go to work. Work felt distant now. The publishing house where I spent 3 days a week seemed to exist in a different dimension. I would sit in my cubicle and read manuscripts about people's lives and wonder if they understood that homes have their own consciousness, their own appetite, their own way of selecting who stays and who leaves. October turned to November. I bought heavy blankets I didn't need. I stocked the pantry with canned goods. I made the house winter ready, which made no practical sense given that the house had been managing itself fine, but the action seemed important. It felt like a covenant. Like I was saying, I'm committing to this. I'm staying. The night I finished preparing the house for winter, I found a cup of tea on my nightstand. I was certain it hadn't been there when I went to bed. Certain that I'd locked my bedroom door, a habit I'd maintained despite understanding it was pointless. The tea was still warm. The bag was still steeping, chamomile, I think, though the scent was different somehow. Floral in a way that didn't match anything in my kitchen. I drank it. It tasted like comfort. It tasted like something made with intention. It tasted like an acknowledgement of care between two entities who had agreed to share a space and were learning, slowly, what that meant. That was 3 months ago. Now it's mid-February, and the house and I have settled into #additional middle section of house, settled around me that first week in a way that felt less like creaking and more like breathing. I'd wake at 3 in the morning to the sound of it, Not a sudden crack, but a prolonged exhalation. The kind of sound you'd make if you were trying not to disturb someone sleeping beside you. The floorboards would shift in sequence down the hallway outside my bedroom, not all at once, but deliberately, methodically, as though something were walking its perimeter. I started to understand the geometry of the place through sound alone, the way voices traveled, how a footstep in the attic would resonate differently depending on whether it occurred above the master bedroom or above the kitchen. The house had become an instrument, and I was learning to read its language. During the day, I could almost convince myself it was normal. Sunlight softened the angles of the crown molding. The dust motes seemed natural, suspended in amber afternoon light, but there was something wrong with the way light moved through the rooms. It didn't follow a predictable path. In the formal dining room, even at midday, one corner remained shadowed. Not dark, but distinctly cooler. A pocket of dimness that persisted regardless of where I positioned myself or which windows I opened. I stood in that corner once. The temperature change was immediate and severe, enough to raise the hair on my arms. The kitchen was the worst room, not because anything happened there, but because of what didn't happen. It was the only room in the house where silence felt wrong. Other rooms had their ambient sounds, the ticking of settling foundations, the whisper of wind in the eaves, the occasional groan of pipes behind the walls. But the kitchen absorbed sound. I'd speak aloud in there to test it, and my voice would die just after leaving my mouth, as though the room actively rejected it. It made me reluctant to spend time there. I ate standing at the counter, facing the doorway, my meals hurried and cold. There was a smell in the hallway I couldn't identify. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong, like old paper and something metallic underneath, like copper coins left in a pocket for too long. It was strongest near the basement door, where it seemed to leak up through the cracks in the frame like something was breathing from below. I kept that door locked, not because I was afraid to go down. I'd explored the basement thoroughly my first day, but because the smell was less oppressive when the door was sealed. The previous tenant, Alex, had left more behind in furniture. In the closet of the second bedroom, I found receipts still in their pockets. A dry cleaning ticket dated March of last year. In a drawer beneath the window seat, a handful of photographs, old ones, black and white, the edges soft with age. They showed the house as it must have been decades earlier, but the furniture was wrong. Too modern for when the house was built. The photographs were labeled on the back in pencil, 1947, spring. The couch in one photo was the same shade of green as the one I'd seen in Alex's inventory list, the one they'd left behind because it was too worn to move. I found a journal, too, just 3 pages, loose, tucked behind a loose bit of wallpaper in the study closet. The handwriting was precise and diminishing, neat at first, then increasingly hurried, until the final entry was nearly illegible. The first legible passage read, "The rooms change when you're not looking at them. I've begun to map the house, to draw it as it should be, but the drawings never match what I find when I walk the corridors again." Yesterday the hallway was 6 feet shorter. I measured it twice. The other entries were fragments. Something moves behind the walls at night. I can hear it in the spaces between the studs. In the morning, there are marks on the inside of the plaster. Fingernails? Why am I thinking about fingernails? And later, the house has been occupied longer than I have. The walls remember. They remember tenants from before the house was built. I found those words the day I noticed the footprints. They were in the attic, on the wooden floorboards beneath the eastern eave. Not fresh, not exactly. They were faint, pressed into the accumulated dust of years, or at least they appeared to be. But they formed a pattern, back and forth, back and forth. From the far corner where the roof line descended to barely 4 feet to the central beam, then back again. Hundreds of times, perhaps, the floorboards in that path had been worn smooth in 2 narrow parallel lines, like the treads of stairs worn by countless feet. No one went into that corner. I hadn't gone into that corner. The space was too confined, and the air up there was wrong, stale and somehow thick, as though it had been breathed 100 times over. When I climbed the pull-down ladder and poked my head into the attic, I could taste it. Metal and old paper and something like rust. The smell that leaked from beneath the basement door had its twin here, and they seemed to be the same thing, seeping from different parts of the house's skeleton. I slept poorly. The insomnia wasn't from fear exactly. It was more insidious than that. It was the sense that sleep would be unsafe, that closing my eyes while in this house was a mistake. So I lay awake in the dark, listening. My bedroom door was open. I'd closed it on my second night, and the sound it made, not a slam, just a slow, deliberate swing inward, had been enough to ensure I never closed it again. The radiators hissed in a pattern I began to recognize. Heat, then silence. Then that exhalation through the vents that sounded like breathing. I mapped this rhythm. 3 minutes of heat. 42 seconds of silence. Then the exhalation. It was consistent, deliberate, the kind of consistency that suggested intention. By the 3rd week, I stopped questioning whether I was imagining the sounds. The house had a rhythm, and I had synchronized to it. I woke at 3:14 each night, a minute before the most pronounced sound, a creaking that began at the far end of the hallway and traveled toward my room, stopping just outside my door. Then silence. Then the sound of something settling, like a weight shifting on old wood. The photographs in the second bedroom became important. I arranged them on the window seat in chronological order, trying to piece together a timeline. The earliest was from 1947. The latest, 1983, but in almost none of them was the house the same. Walls had been added, removed, doorways relocated. Staircases seemed to move. One photograph from 1967 showed what appeared to be 3 hallways converging at a point that, when I checked the current house layout, didn't exist. There was a wall there now. But the photograph was clear. The angle suggested the picture had been taken from inside the house, from a perspective that was geometrically impossible given the current dimensions. I began to understand that the previous tenants hadn't been imagining things. They had been mapping a house that was still changing, still rebuilding itself according to some architecture that existed beneath the visible one. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was occupied, not by something outside the walls, but by the memory of every room it had ever been, every layout, every tenant, every moment of its existence, all layered atop one another like photographs stacked in an envelope, each one visible if you knew how to look. And the footprints in the attic, worn into the floorboards by repetition that spanned decades or perhaps centuries, those weren't made by anyone who had lived here. They were made by something that had been here before the house was built. Mething that resembles peace, though I'm careful not to call it that. Peace implies an ending, an arrival at a destination. This feels more like a beginning, or a continuation of something that began long before I arrived, something that simply incorporated me into its ongoing narrative. The journal has stopped producing new entries. The handwriting, that strange amalgamation of Samuel's careful script and whatever else has always lived in this house, ceased appearing around Christmas. I read the entries sometimes, but less and less frequently. They feel like historical documents now, proof of a transition that's already been completed. I've begun writing in the journal myself. Not much. Small observations. The kind of thing someone keeps a house diary for. The day I replaced the gutter on the east side. The morning I found deer tracks in the snow on the back lawn. The evening I heard music coming from somewhere I still haven't found the source, and realized I wasn't afraid of it anymore. My handwriting looks different in the journal now, too. Not drastically. But there's something in the way I form my letters that's begun to shift. Something that makes the script look less distinct from the other entries, less like an intruder in the narrative. The only thing that troubles me is the tea. It appears regularly now, 3 or 4 times a week, always on my nightstand, always still warm, always in a cup I don't recognize. I drink it each time because refusing seems unkind, and besides, I've come to associate it with the house's approval, with the sense that something here is pleased with my presence, is feeding me in the way houses feed the people who live in them. But last night, I noticed something. The cup was still on my nightstand when I woke this morning. I'd forgotten to bring it downstairs. I picked it up to take it to the kitchen, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the tea that remained. My face looked back at me, but it wasn't quite my face. The features were slightly too gaunt. The eyes were too dark. The smile, which I hadn't realized I was wearing, was too wide and knowing. I blinked, and the reflection shifted back to normal. My ordinary, tired face in an ordinary cup of tea. I set the cup down and walked away. I didn't bring it to the kitchen. I left it there on the nightstand, and I've left it there ever since. It hasn't moved. The tea hasn't evaporated. The cup, impossibly, isn't dirty. I pass by it every morning when I wake, and I don't look into it anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep and I'm thinking about the shape my life has taken, about the way I've become part of this house as surely as the walls and the floorboards, I wonder what it is that's looking back at me from that cup. I wonder what Samuel saw. I wonder how long he stayed awake at night, staring at his own reflection and trying to recognize himself in it. I wonder, more than anything if eventually I'll stop trying to look away. Story 2. I keep finding dinner set for someone who left decades ago. Why would someone set a table and then simply leave? That's the question that started everything, though I didn't know it at the time. It seemed small enough then, the kind of minor puzzle a house leaves behind when its last inhabitant moves out quickly or dies. In my grandmother's case, it was both. I'd inherited the farmhouse 3 weeks before I actually saw the dining room. The lawyer had been efficient about it. The realtor had been efficient about showing it to me over video. But standing in the actual space, alone with dust moving through the afternoon light like living things, that was different. The house smelled the way old houses always do. Not quite decay, but the memory of decay. Mothballs and old wood and something mineral, like the air itself had aged. The floorboards under my feet were genuine oak, the kind they don't mill anymore, and they sighed when I walked. The wallpaper in the hallway was a pattern from the 50s. Small orange flowers on a cream background, faded to the color of old paper money. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like slow flowers. I'd come alone to assess what needed to be done. My plan was simple: spend a week here, walk through everything, and decide whether restoration was worth the investment or if I should sell. I'm not a sentimental person about family properties. I didn't grow up in this house. My grandmother and I had been cordial, distant. She'd sent birthday cards. I'd sent flowers when she'd had her hip surgery. The estate was hers by default, and therefore mine. That was the entirety of our relationship by the time she died at 84. The dining room was through the kitchen. I remember hesitating at the doorway, not from fear, but from the simple recognition that I was entering something preserved. The curtains were drawn heavy burgundy velvet, and they'd held back the light so completely that the room existed in a kind of permanent dusk. When my eyes adjusted, I saw it. The mahogany table was enormous, dominating the space like a ship. It had to have been 6 feet long, maybe longer. Dark wood, deeply polished, the grain flowing like water beneath the surface. And at one end, positioned as though someone had sat down only minutes ago and might return any moment, was a place setting. Plate, water glass, napkin folded in a precise triangle. I stopped moving. I stood in the doorway and simply looked at it. The plate was white china with a thin blue band around the rim, the kind of thing that belonged in a set, though I saw no others. The napkin was cream-colored linen, and it had been arranged with intention, not casually tossed, but folded, placed, positioned. The water glass was positioned above where a knife would go, and the light from the crack in the curtains caught its rim and made it gleam faintly. My first thought was practical. Someone from the estate sale company, or a neighbor checking in. Or perhaps my grandmother's nurse in those final months had said it and forgotten. Houses accumulate small mysteries like this. The previous owners of every old house leave something behind. A jar of old buttons, a recipe card, a place set at a table. It's the nature of dwelling. Nothing is ever perfectly complete. I walked to the table. The floorboards groaned under my weight. Up close, I could see dust had settled on the plate's surface, a fine gray film, but something about the arrangement suggested it hadn't been there that long. The napkin was still crisp. The fold held sharp edges. I picked up the napkin, and it crackled slightly in my hands. The glass was cool. There was no food, had never been food. It was just the anticipation of a meal, the setting before the arrival. I carried the plate and glass back to the kitchen, thinking nothing of it except a vague annoyance at whoever had left it. The kitchen was what I expected. Old appliances, a sink with separate faucets for hot and cold, a linoleum floor with a pattern that had faded to abstract shapes. I set the plate and glass on the counter and made a mental note to ask the lawyer if there were any details about a house manager or property caretaker. I spent the rest of that first day walking the house. 6 bedrooms, 2 baths, a parlor, a study with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a basement I only looked down into before deciding it could wait. The furniture was sparse in some rooms, dense in others. My grandmother had lived here for decades after my grandfather died, 30 years alone in a house this large. The thought of it created a kind of sadness I didn't expect. I'd never imagined her alone like that, filling the hours, sleeping in a house built for a family. By evening, I'd set up in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the one that had belonged to my grandmother. It had a view toward the barn in the distance, though the barn was empty and slowly collapsing. I'd brought food with me, a cooler of sandwich ingredients, coffee, some canned soup. I ate dinner at 7 o'clock on the bed, watching the light leave the fields beyond the window. The silence was almost ringing. I slept well enough, exhausted by the drive and the walking, and woke at dawn with the kind of clarity that early morning in the country brings. The birds were loud. The light was white and clean. I showered in the ancient bathroom down the hall, where the water pressure was surprisingly good, but the hot water took minutes to arrive, and dressed. And made coffee in the kitchen using an old percolator I found in a cabinet. I was planning to tackle the study, to look through my grandmother's papers and see what remained. Documents, deeds, financial records, the practical debris of an ended life. I was thinking about filing cabinets and old tax returns when I decided to check the dining room again. I don't know why. It wasn't a conscious decision. I was walking past the doorway with my coffee, and I simply stopped and looked in. The place setting had returned. Not the same place setting, because I'd carried that one into the kitchen myself. This was a new configuration. The plate was there again, white with a blue band. The napkin was fresh linen, folded sharp. The glass was positioned precisely above where the knife should go. All of it arranged with the same careful intention, as though someone had moved slowly through the motions, had taken time to make it right. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I drank my coffee. I didn't move. I told myself it was a logical explanation. A housekeeper, a property inspector, some service I didn't know about. But there was no one in the house but me. I checked. There were no vehicles in the driveway. The front door had been locked. I'd locked it myself the night before and again when I came down that morning. I walked to the table. This time I noticed something else. On the small side table beside the dining room's only other window, there was a photograph in a thin metal frame, black and white, creased with age. It showed a young woman, probably in her 20s, with dark hair styled in waves. She was sitting on what looked like a porch step. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that requires effort, a social smile, practiced. Behind her I could see a part of a house, the corner of a window frame. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, was a name. The letters were small and precise, Riley. I picked up the photograph and held it closer to the light from the window. The woman looked at me across 70 years. She had kind eyes. She had the kind of face that belonged to a specific time in the American past. A face from the era of my grandmother's middle years, when this house had been full and alive. Why was her photograph here in the dining room next to where that place was set? I didn't have an answer, and I didn't set the table that morning. I left it exactly as it was. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in bed, a bed that wasn't mine, in a house that wasn't quite mine either, though the deed said otherwise, and listened to the old place settle around me. These Victorian houses have their own language. They creak and shift and sigh as the temperature drops. The radiators clank. The pipes sing low notes in the walls. I knew that. I'd researched it when I first moved in, looking for rational explanations for the sounds that had startled me those first few weeks. But something was different now. Around 3 a.m, I heard footsteps in the hall outside my room. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The kind someone makes when they're being careful not to disturb anyone, when they think everyone else is asleep. I opened my eyes in the dark and listened. The footsteps moved from the staircase toward the back of the house, toward the dining room. I heard the soft creak of the floorboards I knew by heart now, the particular groan of the board just outside the dining room entrance. Then nothing. I got out of bed. My hands were cold. I told myself it was wind, or the house settling, or my own anxiety playing tricks on my exhausted brain. But I put on my robe and went to the hallway. The house was dark, except for the faint blue-black quality of the wee hours, that particular darkness that exists just before dawn, when the world feels less solid than usual. The dining room was exactly as I'd left it. The table, the place setting. The photograph of Riley still propped on the side table, catching what little light came through the windows. But someone had turned the chair toward the window. I was certain I hadn't done it. The chair had been pushed in under the table, positioned as if waiting for someone to be seated. Now it was angled outward, facing the glass, as if whoever, whatever had arranged the place setting had decided to sit and look out at the dark yard beyond. I didn't touch anything. I went back upstairs and lay awake until the sky began to lighten, watching the ceiling gradually shift from black to gray. The next morning, I called Alex. my realtor. The woman who'd sold me the house with vague descriptions of character and original features, and had failed to mention that its previous owner had lived here alone for 43 years before moving into assisted care with no family to visit her. I need to know if anyone has access to this house besides me, I said. I was in my car, parked 2 streets over from the house, unable to articulate why I needed to be away from it to have this conversation. Service people, inspectors, anyone who might have a key. Alex made a sound like she was checking her computer. The inspection was 3 months ago. There shouldn't be anyone scheduled. Why? Is something wrong? I didn't know how to answer that. I just want to know who has access. I can check with the county. There shouldn't be anyone, but I'll verify. She paused. Is this about the house itself? Did something happen? No, I said quickly. Just being thorough. Alex called back 4 hours later. No scheduled inspections. No service people listed. No explanation for keys that might exist in other hands. The place setting disappeared that afternoon. I'd gone into town, to the grocery store, to the library, to anywhere that wasn't the house, and when I returned, I went directly to the dining room, drawn there like a magnet I couldn't resist. The table was bare. The chair was in its proper position. The photograph was still there, still watching from the side table, but the place itself, plate, glass, napkin, the careful arrangement of it all, was gone. I checked the kitchen. The dishwasher was clean and empty. The sink held nothing but the faint smell of drain and old plumbing. I opened the china cabinet, something I hadn't done before, something that felt like crossing a threshold into the house's older secrets, and found dishes I'd never touched, mismatched sets from different eras. A full formal place setting of white china with blue bands, still in its careful arrangement, still pristine and untouched. The plate from the table would have matched this set perfectly. I closed the cabinet and my hands were shaking. That night I heard the footsteps again, earlier this time just after midnight. The same slow, careful pace, the same direction. This time I didn't get out of bed. I lay still and listened to someone, something, move through my house with the kind of intimacy that comes only from living in a place for decades. The footsteps paused at the bottom of the stairs. I heard the slight creak of the dining room entrance. And then came a sound I hadn't expected, the soft scrape of a chair being pulled from under the table. The scrape of wood on wood, real, solid, physical. When I finally went downstairs at dawn, the table was set again. Plate, glass, napkin, everything arranged with that same meticulous care. But this time there was something new on the side table. Next to the photograph of Riley was a glass of water, filled to the brim, the surface tension trembling slightly as if something had just disturbed the air around it. It was still cool when I touched the side of the glass, still fresh, still warm from somewhere inside the house, somewhere that had held it only minutes before. I researched the house's history. It became compulsive. The county clerk's office had records. The newspaper archives were digitized. I spent entire days in the library's special collections room scrolling through microfilm. looking at the grainy photographs of this house when it was new, when it was the center of some small social world I could barely imagine. The house was built in 1923. There was a photograph of it in the local gazette from that year, opening day of the season. Some event I couldn't quite decipher from the caption. It had been modified, expanded, loved. The gardens had been extensive. A woman had lived here, multiple women across the decades, and then for the last several decades, just one. I found her name in the property records. Morgan had owned the house for 43 years, had lived here alone for 43 years. The deed transfer to my name had happened 18 months ago, after Morgan had moved into the care facility. After the house had sat empty for a peculiar amount of time, 8 months. Not long enough for anyone to notice, not quite long enough for the house to truly settle into abandonment. But I couldn't find much about Morgan's life. No obituary yet. She was apparently still alive somewhere, in some facility, her mind probably elsewhere entirely. No photographs in the town records. No mention of her in any social capacity. She'd become invisible long before she'd left the house. The only clear image I found was from 1952, a group photograph at some community event. Morgan was there, younger then, standing in the back row. And standing beside her, one arm linked with hers, was a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. The photograph quality was poor, but I was certain it was Riley. Or rather, it was the same woman whose picture now sat on the side table in my dining room. The photograph I'd never brought into that space. The photograph that had simply appeared the way the place setting appeared, the way everything else appeared when I wasn't watching. I didn't sleep much anymore. I'd begun to notice the house in ways I hadn't before. The way certain rooms felt colder than they should. The way the hallway on the second floor had a particular quality to it. A kind of held breath, like walking through somewhere that was waiting for something to happen. The way the dining room felt, occupied even when I was standing alone in it, even when the table was bare. I began leaving things out. Not the place setting, I couldn't bring myself to do that, but other things. A glass of water by the photograph. A fresh linen napkin, watching to see if they'd be moved, touched, disturbed by whatever care and intention moved through this house after I went to bed. They were always gone by morning. One night I heard singing. It was faint, coming from downstairs, a melody without words that belonged to a different era. It stopped the moment I got out of bed, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. The next morning, the photograph was gone from the side table. Just gone. Not moved, not replaced, simply absent. As if Riley had finally looked at the place set in her honor and decided that was enough. I searched the house, every room, every drawer, every shelf and corner and closet. She wasn't anywhere. Her image had vanished as completely as she must have, decades ago, leaving behind only the place setting that kept returning. The careful arrangements that waited for me to understand what no one had ever bothered to explain. On the dining room table, I found something I hadn't placed there. A napkin. folded sharp, positioned exactly where it should go. And beside it, in faded ink on old paper, was a sentence in careful script, "Please remember us." I didn't touch it. I simply stood there in the morning light, and I listened to the house breathe around me. A house full of people who had lived here, loved here, and who refused, absolutely refused to leave. I stopped leaving the house during the day. It felt dishonest somehow, like abandoning my post. The grocery trips became shorter. I'd make excuses to myself about inventory, about not needing much. Though the truth was simpler, I was afraid of what I'd find when I came back. The arrangements had become more elaborate. It started small. The place setting remained, yes, but now it was accompanied by other details. A cloth napkin folded into a precise triangle. A bread plate positioned exactly where it should be. Then, one morning, there was a wine glass, actual crystal delicate, with a faint bloom of dust that suggested it had come from somewhere deep in the house, somewhere I hadn't found in my searches. The glass sat empty, catching the morning light, waiting. I began keeping a notebook. I told myself it was for documentation, evidence of something rational, something that could be cataloged and explained away. But even as I wrote down dates and descriptions, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't documenting. I was confessing. Tuesday, 9:47 a.m., place setting fully arranged. New addition, bread plate with small indent from years of use. The indentation of someone's thumb? Wednesday evening, heard footsteps on the second-floor hallway. Distinct, unhurried, stopped when I opened my bedroom door. The silence afterward felt like listening. Thursday, found a serving spoon on the dining room floor, sterling silver. Monogram too worn to read clearly. Not from any drawer I've seen, not from anywhere in this house that belongs to me. The house was no longer waiting. It was inviting me to participate. I found myself setting my own place at the table opposite the arrangement that kept reappearing. It felt absurd. I sat there with my coffee, my morning toast, positioned where the other person should be, or had been, or perhaps still was in some way that didn't require a visible form. I told myself it was research, an experiment, a way to understand the pattern, but I was talking to her. Or them. I was speaking into the empty chair across from me, asking questions that echoed in the dining room's particular quality of held attention. "What happened to you?" I asked the air. "What happened to Riley?" The chair never answered, but something did. That night I found photographs scattered across my bed. Not the single image I'd discovered in the town records, a new collection, printed on different paper, in different styles, spanning years. Morgan and Riley together. Morgan and Riley at different ages. The same woman, never aging, never changing. Morgan and Riley at what looked like the edge of a garden, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. But the photographs themselves were wrong. Deteriorated, water-stained, edges curled and darkened as though they'd been buried, or kept in a place without light or air. The images were fading, too, like they were losing their grip on reality with each passing moment. In the most recent ones, the ones from the 1950s, Riley was barely visible, her figure translucent, a ghost already becoming a memory. I didn't remember bringing those photographs upstairs. I didn't remember leaving the house to find them. That's when I knew absolutely, without the buffer of doubt or rational explanation, that I was no longer alone in a way I could understand. The footsteps came more frequently. They moved through the house with purpose now, not the hesitant wandering of something confused about where it was. They traced a pattern, the hallway outside my bedroom, down the stairs, across the foyer, into the dining room, every evening, always at the same time, always unhurried. The footsteps of someone who knew this house well, who moved through its spaces with the familiarity of decades. I stopped trying to time them or follow them. Confrontation felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. Not dangerous to my body, but dangerous to something more fundamental. The balance of the house. The arrangement it was making. The agreement it seemed to expect from me. Instead, I began to anticipate the routine. I would come downstairs before the footsteps began. I would sit in the dining room and wait. And every evening, the table would transform while I watched and didn't watch, my attention drifting, my consciousness somehow elsewhere, until there it was. Perfect place setting. Crystal glass, napkin folded sharp, everything positioned with the kind of precision that speaks of love. And then a second place would appear, not set for me, but near me. A plate with something on it, nothing I recognized. Phantom food that existed in the logic of this house, but not in any world I could touch. A wine glass with liquid that caught the light strangely. A napkin folded in a style from a different era. One evening I found myself reaching toward that glass. My hand was steady. I felt calm in a way that terrified me more than any sound ever could. My fingers were inches from the rim when the temperature in the room dropped so severely that my breath came out visible, and I stopped. It wasn't rejection. It was instruction. I pulled my hand back. I understood finally what the place setting meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was a request. A plea that had been sitting at my dining table for months, waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge, to accept that I was living in a house full of people who had loved each other so completely that absence couldn't diminish it. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the dining room in the dark and listened to the house, to the footsteps that moved like language, to the settling of wood that sounded like sighing, to the particular silence that fills a room when something is looking at you with intention, waiting to see if you finally understand. By morning, there were 4 place settings. I hadn't heard her set the additional ones. I'd been awake the entire time, listening, watching the darkness, and yet they'd appeared anyway, as if the house itself was setting the table, as if Morgan and Riley had brought others into the arrangement, others who loved them, others who refused to forget, others who were waiting for someone, anyone, to remember them the way they remembered each other. I understood then what the notebook was for, what the documentation meant. It wasn't evidence. It was beginning to write something down, the way you might record a history that no one else knew. The way you might start to tell a story that desperately needed to be told. The way you might ensure that when you inevitably disappeared into this house, because I could feel it now, that gentle inevitability, the way it was making space for me at that table, someone would find these words and understand that I hadn't been alone, that I'd never been alone, that the house, in its own language of place settings and footsteps and phantom dinners, had been asking one thing all along: please remember us. And I was finally beginning to say yes. The notebook sits on my kitchen counter now. I don't write in it anymore. That stopped sometime in the second week of November. Though I can't pinpoint exactly when I made the decision to stop, or if it was my decision at all. What I have written fills 43 pages. I've read through them countless times, each time expecting them to seem like the documentation of someone losing their grip on reality. Instead, they read like a diary, like someone finally learning to pay attention. Like someone who'd been living in a house and never truly seen it until the house decided it was time to be seen. The place settings stopped appearing in December. I came downstairs one morning and found the dining room exactly as it should be, table bare, chairs pushed in, nothing out of place. My initial feeling was relief. I remember standing in the doorway and feeling my shoulders drop, feeling the small muscles in my chest unlock after months of holding tight. This is good, I told myself. This is normal. This is what you wanted. But it wasn't. Not really. What I wanted, I realized in the silence of that empty room, was impossible. You can't want a haunting to stop once you've learned to love it. You can't ask a presence to leave and mean it in any way that matters. The footsteps continued through December, but they changed. They became less routine, less insistent. Some nights I would hear them clearly, that measured pace down the hallway. The specific creak of the third stair that Morgan or Riley had been making for months. Other nights there was only silence, and I would lie awake wondering if they'd tired of me, if my failure to disappear into the arrangement had disappointed them, if I'd somehow failed a test I hadn't fully understood. In January, the house settled into something like cohabitation. I began to notice things I might have attributed to my own presence if the house hadn't been empty for so long. Coffee cups left beside the sink, not phantom ones actually there, real ceramic I could touch, yet empty of any evidence of how they'd arrived there. A book left open on the living room sofa, the spine cracked to a passage about Victorian domestic life. A photograph I'd never seen before, displayed on the mantel, it showed two people in clothing from the 1950s. Their faces blurred as if the camera had caught them mid-gesture, mid-word, mid-moment of forgetting they were being watched. I didn't look too closely at that photograph. Some things are less unsettling when you allow them to remain peripheral. The house's language changed. It stopped being a request and became something closer to conversation. I would leave a note on the kitchen table, nothing elaborate, just something mundane. Fixing the loose floorboard in the upstairs hall today, or found a crack in the basement wall, and the next morning the space beside my note would have something waiting. Not a response in any literal sense, but an acknowledgement. A penny placed beside my words dated 1952. A strand of what appeared to be hair, long and dark, left as if it had simply fallen there. A recipe torn from a magazine, the ingredient list marked with small notations in handwriting that belonged to no one who could be alive. I stopped being frightened around week 3 of January. That might be the most unsettling part of all, if I'm being honest. Fear serves a purpose. It keeps you alert. It reminds you that boundaries exist, that there are rules about what belongs in the world and what doesn't. When fear leaves, you're left with something far more complicated. Acceptance. The knowledge that you've made a choice, even if that choice was made so gradually you never noticed the moment you made it. By February, I'd stopped going to work. I called my supervisor and told him I was resigning. He was confused, tried to understand, asked if something was wrong. I explained that I'd inherited the house from an elderly relative, that there were things that needed attention that I couldn't leave. All of this was technically true, though not in any way he would have understood. He seemed relieved, if I'm being honest. I'd been strange in the weeks before, distant, preoccupied. Everyone noticed. It was probably a kindness, letting me go. The money won't last forever. The house will need repairs. Winter will come again. These are practical problems that exist in the world of consequences and time and the normal operation of things. But they feel distant now, like something happening in another version of this place that I used to inhabit. What #additional middle section atmospheric expansion the house had a particular smell that I could never quite name. Not mold exactly, though there was that too, lurking beneath everything like a bass note. It was something older, something that had soaked into the plaster and wood across decades until it became indistinguishable from the structure itself. I would stand in the kitchen doorway some mornings, before the coffee was made, before I'd fully convinced myself that what I'd seen the night before was real, and just breathe it in, that smell. It reminded me of old books left in damp attics, of fabric that had been folded away for too long, of time itself, if time had a scent. The dining room was where I spent most of my attention those first weeks. Not out of morbid fascination, I told myself it was investigation, methodical observation. The truth was simpler and stranger. I couldn't stay away. The table itself was mahogany, I think. The finish had dulled to a deep chocolate color, interrupted by pale rings where glasses or cups had been set down and forgotten. The wood was still beautiful beneath the neglect. I would run my hand along the edge, feeling the careful joinery, the craftsmanship of something made to last. And it had lasted. Through decades of dust and silence, it remained. Patient, waiting, the chairs were upholstered in a burgundy fabric that had faded to a rust color in the places where sunlight found its way through the windows. The fabric was dry to the touch, brittle almost. When I sat in one of them, which I did, late one afternoon when the light was turning gold and slanting through the windows in a way that made the dust motes visible. The chair held my weight with surprising firmness. The seat cushion had compressed unevenly, shaped by years of use. I wondered where the person who last sat here had gone. Not just physically. I knew the house had been left empty, the way empty houses are left. But where had their presence gone? How did a person's habit of sitting in a particular chair simply dissolve? The wallpaper in the dining room was another kind of time capsule, a cream background with a pattern of faded blue flowers, nothing elaborate, just a small repeating flower with leaves, elegant in its restraint. In some places where the afternoon sun hit the western wall, the pattern had bleached almost entirely away, leaving only the memory of the design. In other places, particularly in the corners and behind where furniture must have stood, the color remained vivid, almost startling in its vividness. Blue flowers that had been protected from the sun, that had waited in shadow for 50 years. I would stand before these sections and feel something shift in my chest. The contrast was unbearable somehow. The faded and the preserved, existing in the same room, the same wall, separated only by inches. Water stains marked the ceiling in places, browns and yellows in abstract patterns that resembled maps of countries that didn't exist. I traced them with my eyes, but never with my fingers. There was something about touching those stains that felt like an invasion. They told a story of the house's struggle against the elements, the slow creep of moisture and time. I wondered if whoever had set the table so carefully had ever looked up at those stains and thought about leaving, or if they'd simply grown accustomed to them the way we grow accustomed to all the imperfections of home. The silence in the house was not absolute. It had texture. There were the sounds that old structures make, the settling of wood, the tick of pipes cooling or warming, the soft creak of floorboards responding to changes in humidity. At night, these sounds were more pronounced. I would lie in my bedroom, not the master bedroom. Something in me recoiled from that space, and listened to the house breathing. That's what it sounded like. Not frightening, exactly, intimate in a way that made me uncomfortable. The house was alive in its own way, aware of my presence in it the way I was becoming aware of its presence in mine. I began to notice the light at different times of day. The morning light was thin and blue, filtered through windows that needed cleaning. It highlighted every imperfection, dust, the tracks of insects long dead, the smudges of previous inhabitants. By noon, the light had a quality of resignation to it, a kind of neutral gray illumination that made everything look slightly out of focus, as though I was seeing the house through a veil. It was the afternoon light that troubled me most. Golden, slanting, almost theatrical in its warmth, it made the house look inhabited. It made shadows pool in corners and doorways that seemed very deep. It illuminated dust in the air and made it look like something moving. I would stand in this light and feel as though I was being watched by it, as if the light itself was conscious, was taking my measure. The floors were hardwood throughout the main level, scratched and scarred by years of movement. Certain paths were worn smooth, the finish nearly transparent in those places. The path from the kitchen to the dining room, the path from the dining room to the hallway, the path that would have been walked thousands of times by someone moving through their own home the way any of us move through ours, without thinking, without knowing that one day they would walk it for the last time. I became hyper-aware of how much of the house I was not exploring. The upper floor remained largely untouched. I would climb the stairs sometimes, my hand moving along the banister, which was smooth and cool and had absorbed the oils of many hands before mine, and reach the landing, then turn around and come back down. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched into shadow. Doors lined it, all of them closed. I could not bring myself to open them. The kitchen remained the only space besides the dining room where I spent extended time, and even that was uncomfortable. I would make tea and hold the cup and stand at the counter and feel how much of the space belonged to someone else's memory. The cellar door was in the kitchen, built into a wall that had been painted white decades ago. The paint had yellowed and cracked. A lock, old, the kind with a skeleton key, was fixed to the frame, but it had never been engaged. I would stand before that door sometimes and feel the cool air that seemed to emanate from beneath it. Not the air itself, exactly, a sensation, a quality. The cellar was a separate entity from the rest of the house, a place with its own climate, its own time. I began keeping a log, not obsessively or not at first, but I found myself noting the small details, the exact arrangement of the place settings, whether the napkins had been folded in a particular way, whether there was anything on the plates themselves beyond the dust. It was during this cataloging that I realized my memory of the first night was already becoming uncertain. Was the water glass filled to the top or only partially full? Was the fork on the left side of the plate, or had I remembered that incorrectly? The more I tried to recall precisely what I had seen, the less sure I became. The image was already slipping away from me, becoming mythologized in my own mind, and yet something was clearly wrong. Intentionally wrong. The table didn't dress itself. Chairs didn't move. Plates didn't arrive. Someone or something was behind this, and the longer I stayed in the house, the more I understood that I was meant to notice. I was meant to stand in the doorway and see the evidence of an absence that was somehow also a presence. The house was patient with me. It revealed nothing and everything simultaneously. Each day brought new small observations. The way light moved across the table, the particular quality of silence in the room, the overwhelming sense that I was a guest here, an interloper, a temporary disturbance in something far more permanent than myself. Steed's now is smaller, more intimate. I've started leaving place settings at my own table again. Not because I expect the phantom ones to return. I'm not sure that's possible anymore, or if it ever really was, but because there's something comforting about the gesture itself. about the ritualization of it. I set 4 plates now, out of habit, or maybe out of acknowledgement, maybe out of love, which is what the house taught me these place settings mean. Some nights I swear I can smell dinner cooking, though my kitchen remains empty and cold. Some nights I hear the sound of voices in rooms I'm not in, not distinct enough to be words, just the warm murmur of people comfortable in each other's silence. Last week I found a lipstick mark on one of my coffee cups, a shade that hasn't been manufactured in decades, and I didn't wash it off. The notebook sits closed. I don't know if I'll ever write in it again. What would I document? The absence of absence? The way a haunting can become so integrated into the texture of a place that you stop seeing it as haunting and start seeing it as simply home? The oddest thing is how quiet my grief has become. I thought I was grieving my old life, the job, the distance, the careful compartmentalization of myself into someone normal. But that's not it. What I'm grieving is the possibility that they, Morgan and Riley and all the others whose names and faces I'll never know, might have forgotten. That the intensity of their love might have faded. That they might have stopped reaching out. But they haven't. I know they haven't because the house tells me every day in small, unmistakable ways. Last night I found a note on my pillow. Just 3 words, written in handwriting that trembled slightly, as if the hand holding the pen had been unsteady from age or emotion or the difficulty of manifesting pen and paper and intention all at once. Please stay with us. I'm still here. The sun is rising over the same street I've lived on for 6 months now, though it feels like a different season, not in the calendar sense, but in some deeper register where time moves differently. The coffee is brewing. The house is warm. Somewhere in the walls or in the spaces between the walls or in whatever country of the dead this place partially exists in, they're waiting for me to come downstairs. There are place settings to set. There are silences to feel with presence. There are people here who loved each other so completely that death couldn't divide them, and who have impossibly decided that they love me too. I'm learning to say yes to that every morning. Every single morning, I'm learning to say yes. And in the corner of the dining room, where the light never quite falls straight, there's a chair that's been pulled out just slightly, as if someone's about to sit, or has just stood, or exists in that eternal moment of decision between arrival and departure. I never push it back in. I never have, and I don't think I ever will. Story 3. The hallway photograph show rooms that disappeared last week. The floorboards in the hallway creak in a specific pattern. 3 steps in from the landing, they settle with a long, almost musical groan. 2 more steps, and there's a sharper snap. Then silence until you reach the far end, where the wood seems to hold its weight differently, more stubborn, less forgiving. I've learned this the way you learn the particular personality of a place that's already decided whether it likes you. I'm Morgan. I've owned this townhouse for 6 weeks. The hallway on the 2nd floor is narrow, the way Victorian narrow is, designed for a body moving through it single file, with purpose, not lingering. The walls wear paper that's probably original, though I can't be certain. The pattern is small blue flowers, almost too small to resolve into actual blooms if you don't focus on them directly. Faded to a soft gray blue on the south-facing side, where light from the single window has been patient and relentless for what I assume is decades. The window itself is tall and narrow, looking out onto the street below. The glass is old enough that looking through it creates a slight wavering sensation, like you're seeing the outside world through something liquid. When the afternoon light comes through, it turns the hallway into a specific shade of blue. Not cold, not warm, something else entirely. My aunt left me this house. Her name was Rebecca, and she lived here for 43 years. And I grew up visiting during summers, but I never paid particular attention to the second floor. It was just a place you pass through to get to bedrooms. A corridor, nothing more. Now I live here. Now I have time to notice things. The thing I noticed first was the proportions. It's settled enough that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been dealing with furniture. The house came to me furnished, which was both a gift and a problem. My aunt had kept things exactly as they'd always been, or as she'd wanted them to be, and that meant navigating the reality of living in a place someone else had designed. I needed to reorganize, to make it mine in some practical sense, even if I didn't fully want to. I have 3 bedrooms, 2 at either end of the hallway, one down a short corridor that branches off the main landing. The hallway itself is the skeleton holding the whole second floor together. It's the space between the private rooms, the artery. And when I started measuring, just to understand furniture flow, just to know if I could fit the dresser I'd brought from my apartment, I realized the hallway was shorter than it should have been. It was the exterior that tipped me off. The house is a narrow townhouse squeezed between 2 others on a residential block in the western part of the city. The kind of structure that looks like it's holding in its stomach. From outside, the second floor spans a certain width. The windows confirm it. You can see the roof line, the window placement, the way the wall faces the street. Then you come inside, pace the hallway, measure it, and the numbers don't align. There's something like 2 feet of missing space. I didn't dwell on it at first. Old houses shift. Walls are never where they appear to be from outside. The interior has a logic that's separate from the exterior, especially in buildings this old. But the discrepancy bothered me in the way that small, impossible things do, the way you can't quite unsee them once you've noticed them. It was Thursday evening when I started looking through the boxes in the study. The study is on the first floor, adjacent to what used to be the formal dining room. My aunt kept documents there, photographs, the accumulated paper of a life lived in one place. When I inherited the house, I also inherited the responsibility of sorting through it all, deciding what stayed and what became archive or landfill. I'd been putting it off with the particular stubbornness of someone who knows that opening those boxes means committing to a larger project. But I needed something specific, a deed or a property description. something that might explain the hallway's dimensions. The boxes were stacked 3 high in the back corner, wrapped in brown paper that had taken on the color of old butter. When I opened the first one, the smell came up like a sigh. The particular smell of old photograph chemicals and paper. Dust that settled into a permanent state of dormancy. My aunt had been a careful person. She'd labeled the boxes in her precise handwriting. Photos 1980-1995. Photos 1960-1979. That sort of thing. Clearly organized, which made the search easier and somehow more unsettling, as if her organizational system was a voice reaching from the past. I wasn't looking for photographs. I was looking for paperwork. But the way the boxes were stacked, I had to move the photo boxes to get to what I suspected was underneath. The first photograph I saw wasn't intentional. I set a box on the desk beside me, and a stack of prints shifted inside. Some of them slid out onto the wooden surface, and I reached over to gather them before they scattered further. The photograph showed the hallway. It was unmistakably the hallway on the second floor. The same wallpaper, or at least an earlier version of the same pattern before the fading. The same window, the same proportions and shadows. But in the photograph there were doors, not 1 or 2, more than that. Multiple doors lining both sides of the hallway, evenly spaced, receding into shadow. The photograph was in black and white, which made it harder to place in time. No date visible on the print, but the quality of the paper, the size, and the printing method suggested mid-20th century, maybe earlier. I gathered the other prints and looked through them more carefully. Most of them were what I'd expect to find in a family archive: portraits, group photographs, images of my aunt at different ages, some pictures of the house itself from the exterior. But there were others. More hallway photographs, different angles, different lighting, but all of them showing the same impossible thing: a hallway full of doors. In one photograph, the camera was positioned looking down the hallway toward the window. The doors receded into shadow on either side. I could count them. 7 doors on the left side, at least 6 on the right, before the perspective made them indistinct. In the house, right now, there are 2 doors on the left side of the hallway. One leading to the front bedroom. One leading to a closet I've never used. On the right side, there's one door leading to the back bedroom, and one more. The entrance to the short corridor that accesses the third bedroom. That's 4 doors total, plus 2 closets. Not 7 on one side. Not the warren of doors I was looking at in these photographs. I sat at the desk with the print spread out in front of me, and I became aware of the silence in the house. It's a particular kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but a presence of quiet so complete it almost has texture. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own pulse. My aunt must have known about the doors. These were her photographs, stored in her boxes, organized with her careful hand. She'd lived in this house for over 40 years. She would have known if the hallway had once contained multiple doors. She would have known when they disappeared, if they disappeared during her tenure. I looked for more of her archives, documentation, any kind of explanation. The rest of that box contained mostly family photographs. My grandparents, my aunt at various ages, usually alone. The house appeared frequently, exterior shots, pictures taken from the street, a few images of the front rooms, but nothing else about the hallway. I opened the next box. Photos 1960-1979, the label read. Inside toward the middle of the stack, I found more of the hallway, this time in color. Faded but definitely color. And the hallway in these photographs was different again. The wallpaper was a different pattern entirely, more ornate, with what looked like a damask design in greens and golds. And the doors, there seemed to be fewer doors, but perhaps that was just the angle of the photograph, the way the light fell. There was only one photograph of the hallway in this box. Just one clear image, and then nothing else. By the time I'd gone through both boxes, I'd found maybe 15 photographs of the hallway, scattered across 60 years of my aunt's life. Each one showing the space differently, wallpaper changing, the number and placement of doors shifting subtly across decades, the light falling at different angles, as if the very dimensions of the hallway itself had been rearranged between photographs. I laid them all out on the desk in chronological order, the way my aunt's labels suggested, earliest to most recent. What I was looking at was a progression of a space getting smaller. More doors became fewer doors. The ornate wallpaper gave way to simpler patterns. The hallway in the oldest photographs, the ones I suspected dated to the 1950s or 1960s, showed a space that seemed significantly longer, more populated, almost deliberately designed to house multiple rooms. And the hallway in the most recent photographs, taken maybe 30 years ago, based on the print quality, showed something closer to what I now knew, but still not quite, still wrong. I gathered the photographs carefully and brought them upstairs. The hallway was dark now. It was past 8 o'clock, and the window had become a black rectangle, reflecting only the small table lamp I'd brought from downstairs. I stood in the hallway with the photographs in my hands and tried to match them to the space around me. The proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The photographs showed a hallway that felt deeper, wider somehow. Despite the evidence that the wallpaper was the same pattern, the window was in the same place. The light in the photograph seemed to come from somewhere the hallway doesn't possess now. I walked to the far end of the hallway and turned to look back at the window. The reflected light from my lamp created a small pool of illumination in the darkness. The wallpaper appeared almost blue-black in the low light, the small flower pattern dissolving into shadow. This was the hallway. This was where I lived now. But according to the photographs my aunt had kept, had organized and stored and preserved, this was not what the hallway had been. I've always been someone who needs to understand the spaces I inhabit. I need to know how they're constructed, what they contain, what they mean. It's not restlessness exactly, more a kind of careful attention, a need for the geometry to make sense. The hallway was not making sense. And as I stood there in the dark, listening to the old house settle around me, I became aware that I'd brought the photographs upstairs, but hadn't put them away. They were still in my hands, still in my field of vision, still showing me a hallway that no longer existed, or perhaps a hallway that existed in some way I didn't yet understand. The floorboards creaked in their familiar pattern as I walked back toward the landing. 3 steps in, that long, musical groan, and I thought about my aunt, living in this house for 43 years, walking this hallway countless times, knowing what it had been and what it had become, not wondering why the doors had disappeared, knowing that distinction seemed important, though I couldn't have said why. I spent the next 3 days measuring the hallway. It sounds obsessive now writing it down. Possibly it was. But I'd inherited my aunt's meticulous nature along with the house itself. That careful documentation, that need to record and verify. So I bought a metal tape measure from the hardware store in town, and I measured everything. The width from wall to wall at 3 different points, the length from the landing to the far window, the height of the ceiling, the depth of the alcove where the old radiator sat humming. Then I measured the hallway in the photographs. The photographs were small, hand-printed, the kind my aunt must have had developed years ago. Using the window frame as a reference point, a constant I could trust, I calculated the apparent distance. The hallway in those photographs was approximately 14 inches longer than the hallway I lived in. Not a dramatic difference. The kind of difference that could be explained by angle of view, by the way a camera lens could subtly distort space. Except I'd measured from multiple points. The discrepancy was consistent. I spread the photographs across my desk in the bedroom and studied them in the afternoon light. The date on the back of the oldest one was 1987. The newest was from 1993. In all of them, the hallway extended further than it should. In all of them, I could see what appeared to be a door frame at the far end, just before the window. A door frame that no longer existed. I knocked on the wall where the door frame should have been. Solid plaster. Nothing behind it but the exterior wall of the house. "You're being ridiculous," I said aloud, testing the words in the empty house. They sounded unconvincing. But that was the thing about inheriting property, about moving into a space that had been shaped by someone else's decades. You develop a relationship with absence. You notice what's missing. My aunt had left most of her furniture, most of her things. The house was full of her presence, the particular arrangement of kitchen items, the books organized by subject in the living room, the way she'd positioned the bedroom furniture to catch the morning light from a specific angle. All of these choices were still there, still speaking to who she had been. But the hallway spoke differently. On the 4th night, I woke to the sound of knocking, not urgent, not loud. 3 measured taps, the kind of sound that made you unsure whether you'd actually heard it or dreamed it. I lay in the dark of the bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, waiting to hear it again. The floorboards ticked as they cooled. The radiators made their familiar groaning sounds. Outside, the wind moved through the trees that crowded the property. Old oaks and pines that had been there longer than the house itself. The knocking didn't come again. I told myself it was pipes. Old houses have sounds. Old houses have reasons for the noises they make. But I found myself lying awake. listening to the quality of silence that followed. The particular absence of the knock I wasn't sure I'd heard. In the morning, I searched the house for the source. I opened all the cupboards. I ran the water to see if the pipes responded. I looked for loose windows, for anything that could have caused the sound. Everything was secure. Everything was still. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if I would ask the right questions. Instead, I went back to the photographs. I'd begun to develop a theory, not a coherent one, but something that moved beneath the surface of my thinking like something alive in deep water. The hallway wasn't just different in size. It was different in what it contained. In 1987, there had been a door at the end. In 1989, the door seemed different somehow. The details were harder to see in the smaller print, but the proportions had changed. By 1993, the final photograph, the doorframe was visible but strange, as though it existed at an angle to the rest of the hallway, as though it wasn't quite aligned with the walls around it. And now, in my house, in the present, no door at all. I stood in the hallway again that afternoon, the photographs held loosely in my hands. The light was different at this hour, late October light, thin and precise, cutting through the window at a sharp angle. The wallpaper, which had looked almost blue-black in lamplight, was clearly visible now. Tiny flowers, a green pattern that might have been fashionable 40 years ago, but had faded to something almost abstract. The colors separated by time and sunlight into something that looked more like imagery than design. I could see where the old doorframe had been, not from any physical evidence, but from the way the wallpaper aligned. There was a settled discontinuity in the pattern, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it. If you'd spent hours thinking about absence and geometry and the way a house can contain contradictions. The repair had been careful, professional even, but it was there. Someone had closed this door, sealed it, covered the evidence with wallpaper and time. That night the knocking came again. This time I was awake, sitting at the desk in my bedroom with the photographs in front of me. 3 taps, measured and deliberate. From the hallway, approximately where the door should have been. I didn't move immediately. I sat there with my hands on the edge of the desk, feeling the wood grain beneath my fingers, cataloging the sounds of the house, the wind outside, the creak of the old structure settling, the settled hum of the heating system, all of it normal, all of it explainable, all of it real. I walked to the hallway. The light from my bedside lamp cut a thin line across the floor, illuminating nothing. The hallway existed in darkness beyond that line. I stood at the threshold of my room, listening, waiting for repetition. If it happened again, it would be harder to dismiss. Repetition was the enemy of coincidence. The knocking didn't come again. Instead, I heard what might have been a sound, or might have been the absence of sound, a kind of deepening of the quiet, as though the hallway had suddenly become more solid, more present, as though something had moved inside it. I turned on the hallway light. The hallway was empty. The space between the landing and the far window lay in familiar perspective. All the furniture in its correct place, the radiator humming softly, the wallpaper with its faded flowers visible now in sharp detail, everything as it should be, everything exactly as it always was. But the air felt wrong somehow, too still, as though it had been breathed in by something that wasn't quite finished with it. I walked the length of the hallway, counting my steps. 37, the same number I'd counted every time before. I placed my hand against the wall where the door should have been and felt the cool plaster beneath my palm. Solid. Absolute. What are you? I whispered, and the hallway absorbed the words without answering. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness and thought about my aunt, who had lived in this house for 43 years, who had documented what the hallway had been in meticulous photographs, who had watched it change, contract, seal itself off. 43 years of walking past a closed door, of knowing what had been on the other side and accepting the silence that had replaced it. By morning, I'd developed another theory. Less a theory, really, than a question I wasn't quite brave enough to formulate. What if the photograph showed the hallway as it was supposed to be? What if everything since 1993 was the anomaly, the hallway growing smaller, rooms disappearing, a space contracting into something it no longer recognized? What if the hallway I lived in was the haunted one? The thought stayed with me through the day. I tried to dismiss it as the product of too little sleep and too much attention to impossible details, but it had a certain logic to it. The photographs documented change, deterioration, loss. The hallway, as I experienced it, was incomplete. Something was missing. Something had been removed from the space itself. On the 5th night, I heard footsteps. Not heavy, not deliberate, just the soft, familiar sound of someone walking the hallway at night. The floorboards that always creaked at 37 steps now produced the muffled sound of weight distributed across them. Someone was walking from the landing toward the far window. Someone was retracing the path I'd walked 100 times in the past week. But when I opened my bedroom door, the hallway was empty. I stood there in the dark, listening to silence that felt active, charged. The air held a quality of presence. Someone was here. Or something was here. Or the space itself was articulating something that had always existed beneath its surface. The footsteps had stopped directly where the door should have been. I walked toward the sound, toward the sealed wall, my heart moving in my chest with a careful, measured rhythm. The floorboards were warm beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify. Not quite dust, not quite age, but something caught between the two. A smell like closed spaces, like air that hasn't been disturbed in decades. I placed my hands on the wallpaper and felt the seams. Whoever had sealed this doorway had done it long ago, when my aunt was young, when the house was still speaking to her in ways it no longer spoke to anyone. The pattern of flowers beneath my fingers was real. The plaster beneath the paper was real. But the space it occupied felt less real than the absence on the other side. I can see it, I said quietly. The hallway shows me what was here. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting. And in that waiting, I understood something that my aunt must have understood long ago. Some doors are sealed not because what's behind them is dangerous, but because what's behind them refuses to leave. Closing the door doesn't solve anything. It just changes the nature of the haunting. It makes it something you live with every day, something you measure and document and preserve in photographs, something you learn to walk past without looking. The footsteps began again that night, moving toward the sealed doorway. And this time I didn't go to investigate. I lay in bed and listened to them pass. And I understood that my aunt had done the same thing, night after night, for 43 years. And now I would too. The footsteps didn't stop after that first night. They became routine, predictable in their unpredictability, the way a haunting learns to schedule itself into your life until it becomes less like an intrusion and more like a tenant with fixed habits. Every night between 2 and 3 in the morning, I would hear them, always starting at the landing, always moving toward the sealed doorway, always stopping at precisely the same place. I kept a notebook beside my bed. I began to track them, the time they started, the exact pace, variations in the sound. There was a peculiar fastidiousness to this documentation, as though by writing down what was happening, I could transform it into something manageable, something that fit into the rational framework of cause and effect. But the notebook filled anyway, and nothing I wrote in it changed what I heard. On the 9th night, my sleep had grown so fractured that I was no longer certain when I was awake or dreaming. I lay in the darkness with my eyes open, listening to the house settle around me, and I heard the footsteps begin. But this time, they didn't follow the hallway. They came into my bedroom. I didn't move. I kept my breathing steady, kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, and I listened to the sound of someone, something, walking slowly around the perimeter of my room. Not threatening, not approaching, just present. The floorboards announced each step with the soft creak of distributed weight. It was a woman's gait, I thought. Slow, careful, someone measuring the space. When the footsteps reached the foot of my bed, they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No sound from the house, no sound from outside, no ambient noise that usually filled the background of nighttime. Just my own breathing and the sensation of being observed from the darkness at the end of the bed. I couldn't move. Not paralyzed exactly. I could have moved if I'd chosen to, but I understood with a clarity that bypassed rational thought that moving would be a mistake. Some instinct older than language told me to remain still, to make myself as small as possible in the space I occupied. This was what my aunt must have learned to do, I thought. This was the price of living with a hallway that refused to stay sealed. The presence at the foot of my bed held for what might have been seconds or minutes. Time became unreliable. Then the footsteps resumed, walking back toward the door, back into the hallway. The sound of them faded, and with it, the charge in the air seemed to dissipate slightly. Not completely. Never completely. But enough that I could breathe again. I didn't turn on the lights. I lay there in the darkness for the rest of the night and waited for the sun to rise. And when it did, the house looked exactly as it always had. Normal, settled, ordinary, in a way that made the previous hours feel like they might have happened to someone else entirely. But my notebook was on the nightstand, and I had written notes in it without any memory of writing them. The handwriting was mine, but the words were in present tense. As though I'd been documenting something as it happened, she walked around the bed. She stood at the foot. She was waiting for me to do something. She wanted something from me. She won't leave until I understand. I didn't remember writing any of it. The next morning I pulled down the photographs from 1993 again and compared them to the hallway as it existed now. But something was different. The door in the old photographs, the sealed one, was no longer visible in the background. It had been sealed so thoroughly by that point that it barely registered as an absence. Just a slight variation in the wallpaper pattern. But there was something else I hadn't noticed before. A figure in the hallway. A blur, almost, caught at the edge of the frame where the hallway extended back toward the landing. It could have been an artifact of the photograph. A double exposure error, perhaps, or a smudge on the lens. But as I studied it, the shape resolved itself into something more definite. A silhouette. A person standing in the hallway looking back toward the camera. Looking back toward whoever was taking the photograph. My aunt. The thought arrived fully formed without any reasoning behind it. I simply knew. The figure in the hallway was looking at my aunt as she photographed it, which meant my aunt was photographing someone that was standing in the hallway behind her. Something that existed in the space of the house even then, even in 1993, even when the hallway was still almost itself. I called the number my aunt had given me when I'd first arrived at the house. It took several rings before she answered, and when she did, her voice was careful, as though she'd been expecting this call for a very long time. "You've seen her," my aunt said. Not a question. "There's something in the hallway," I said. I was pacing now, my free hand moving through the air as though I could gesture away the reality of what I was saying. There's something that walks at night. And last night it came into my room. It stood at the end of my bed. I found writing in my notebook that I don't remember making. "What did it write?" my aunt asked, and her voice had taken on a strange quality, something between relief and resignation. I looked at the notebook, at the handwriting that wasn't quite mine, at the present tense documentation of an event I couldn't fully remember. That she won't leave until I understand, I read aloud. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my aunt said, "I've been waiting for someone to understand for 43 years. I was beginning to think no one ever would. It's a terrible thing to carry alone." "Understand what?" I said, but I was already moving toward the hallway, already moving toward the sealed doorway, already understanding that the wall between me and whatever had chosen to show itself was far thinner than plaster and wallpaper. "What am I supposed to understand? Why we seals things," my aunt said quietly, "and why sealing them never works." The line went dead. I stood in the hallway in the afternoon light, looking at the sealed doorway, and I realized that the air around it had changed. The temperature had shifted. or the light had changed, bending around the space in a way that made it appear slightly different than it had before. The wallpaper seemed less solid. The plaster beneath it seemed to give slightly when I pressed my hand against it. That night, I didn't wait for the footsteps to come to me. I lay in bed and listened to them begin, and when they reached my doorway, I got up. I followed them out into the hallway. In the darkness, the sealed doorway seemed to pulse with an almost luminous quality. The wallpaper had begun to peel at the edges. The air smelled strongly now of whatever that closed space smell had been. Dust and age and something else. Something like the air of a room that had been sealed so long that it had begun to forget how to exist in the physical world. The footsteps stopped at the doorway. I stood beside it, my hand on the wall, and I heard it clearly now, a sound from beyond the plaster, beyond the sealed space. A sound like breathing, slow and patient and infinitely familiar, as though I'd heard it my entire life without ever consciously registering it. The sound of something that had been waiting behind that wall for 43 years. Something that had learned to pace. Something that had learned to watch. Something that had learned to extend its presence into rooms I thought were mine. Into notebooks I thought I controlled. Into the spaces of my own mind. The breathing continued, and I understood that I no longer had a choice about what came next. The understanding my aunt had been waiting for someone to achieve was this, that some doors, once sealed, begin to seal you instead. And once you understand that, once you truly comprehend it in a way that bypasses all rationality and reason, the hallway becomes something entirely different. It becomes a space where you live. It becomes a space where you wait. It becomes a space where you keep your own photographs and take your own notes. And perhaps someday when someone else inherits this house, when someone else stands in this hallway looking at the accumulation of decades, they too will begin to understand. I placed both my hands on the wall beside the sealed doorway, and the plaster was warm beneath my palms. The breathing from beyond continued, patient and eternal, and I realized that I was breathing in time with it now, that somewhere along the way, without deciding to do so, I had synchronized myself with the rhythm of whatever lived behind that wall. And in that synchronization, I felt the first moment of peace I'd experienced since arriving at the house, which was perhaps the most terrifying moment of all. The morning came gray and ordinary. I woke without remembering falling asleep. My hands were still resting on the wall where I'd left them. The plaster had cooled during the night. The wallpaper had stopped peeling. When I pressed my ear against the sealed doorway, there was only silence. The normal silence of a closed space, dead and indifferent. I went downstairs and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and looked at the photographs again. The room beyond the doorway stared back at me from the screen, exactly as it had been photographed 43 years ago. Exact, unchanging. A space that existed in that particular moment of capture and nowhere else. By afternoon, I was convincing myself that something had shifted in my understanding, but nothing fundamental had changed. The house was still the house. The hallway was still the hallway. The wall was still sealed. I had simply become more aware of certain patterns, certain repetitions, certain peculiarities that had always existed here. That was all. People lived in old houses. Old houses had their eccentricities. That was the reasonable narrative, and I clung to it, because the alternative, the breathing, the synchronization, the realization that I had somehow merged my rhythm with something else's, was not a narrative I knew how to continue living within. My aunt did not call back. I tried her number 3 times that day. Each time it rang once and then went to voicemail. By evening, I'd convinced myself that she had simply moved on, that whatever knowledge she'd been waiting for me to achieve, I'd either achieved it or I hadn't, and either way, the waiting was over. We were adults. We had our own lives. The house was not her responsibility anymore. It was mine. That night, I slept in the bedroom across from the sealed doorway. I locked the door. I told myself it was a practical measure. Old houses had drafts, and locking a door helped with temperature regulation. But as I lay in bed, I understood the true reason. I was afraid that if I left the door open, I might find myself walking again, that my body might make decisions my mind didn't authorize, that the synchronization I'd felt might deepen into something more comprehensive. The footsteps did not come. I listened for them. Hour after hour, I listened with an intensity that was itself a kind of pain, and they did not come. The hallway remained empty. The sealed doorway remained silent. It was as though the house had withdrawn from me the moment I attempted to withdraw from it. By the 3rd night without the footsteps, I found myself getting out of bed. I stood at the locked door and listened. Nothing, I unlocked it and stepped into the hallway. The air was cool and normal. The sealed doorway looked like just a sealed doorway, old plaster, peeling wallpaper. A space of no particular significance. I stood there for an hour waiting for something to acknowledge my presence, and when nothing did, I felt something that was not quite relief. It was closer to abandonment. I returned to the bedroom. But I didn't lock the door. The house settled into a rhythm after that. Days that were unremarkable. Mornings where I drank coffee and tried to focus on work. Afternoons where I moved through the rooms with the deliberate purposefulness of someone trying to prove normalcy through repetition. Evenings where I cooked meals that I ate alone at the kitchen table, imagining conversations with other people, other lives, other possibilities. The photograph notebooks remained in the hallway closet. I didn't look at them. Looking at them would require acknowledging that they existed, that they had been taken for a reason, that they documented something that the person who had sealed the doorway had deemed important enough to preserve. And if I acknowledged that, I would have to think about what came next, about what a person does when they understand that something has chosen not to reveal itself anymore. The house was quieter than it should have been. A house this old should have had settling creaks, the sound of pipes adjusting to temperature changes, the ambient noise of time passing through wood and plaster. But this house had become almost soundless. It was as though the entity, and I no longer had any doubt that was what it had been, what it still was, was simply watching now, not engaging, not extending itself into notebooks or down hallways or into the rhythm of my breathing, just watching from whatever space it occupied beyond the wall, with the patience of something that had learned to wait for 43 years and could wait longer. On the 7th day, I found something on the kitchen counter that I hadn't left there. It was a photograph, not in a frame, just a photograph, slightly yellowed at the edges, placed face down on the counter beside my coffee mug. I knew before I turned it over what it would be. My hands were shaking as I lifted it. They didn't shake because of what the photograph showed. They shook because of what it implied about my assumption that the contact had ended. It showed the hallway outside my bedroom, empty, ordinary, photographed from a distance that suggested it had been taken from inside the bedroom itself, from exactly where I was standing when I took the photograph. Except I had not taken this photograph. I had not owned a camera. I did not develop pictures. I did not know how long this photograph had existed. I understood. With the same clarity I'd experienced standing beside the sealed doorway, that this was the second form of communication, not footsteps, not breathing, but a slow accumulation of impossibilities that couldn't be dismissed as imagination or stress or the particular way that grief makes old houses feel haunted. This was documentation. This was evidence of something that had decided to make itself known not through manifestation, but through patient, methodical proof. I placed the photograph face down on the counter, back where it had been, and I walked away. That evening, I moved my bedroom upstairs. The 3rd floor of the house had never seemed particularly welcoming, but it was distance, and distance felt necessary. I carried my mattress up the narrow stairs and set it in the corner of the smallest room. I told myself it was temporary. A rest. A break from the hallway. I didn't examine the logic too carefully. The nights were different on the 3rd floor. The house made different sounds from this height. The wind moved through the eaves in a way that almost seemed like language, like something trying to communicate in a vocabulary that predated words. I would lie awake and listen to it, and I would think about the photographs in the hallway closet, about the room they documented, about the 43 years that room had spent sealed and waiting, about what would happen if it had been sealed long enough. A month passed. Then another. I fell into patterns that felt almost sustainable. I worked. I ate. I moved through the house in deliberate ways, avoiding the hallway when I could, passing through it quickly when I couldn't. The sealed doorway remained sealed. No new photographs appeared. The footsteps did not return. But something had fundamentally altered in the way I inhabited the house. I was aware now of the presence in a way that had moved past conscious thought. It was like living with someone you never see, like knowing that you share a space with another consciousness, another way of being, and that this sharing is permanent, that you can't leave, or rather, that leaving would accomplish nothing, because whatever had decided to synchronize itself with me during that night in the hallway had already become embedded in my understanding of this place, in my understanding of myself within this place. It was mid-autumn when I found the first new photograph in my pocket. I had no memory of putting it there. It was a close shot of the sealed doorway, taken from a distance of perhaps 2 feet. The plaster and wallpaper were clearly visible in grainy detail. The peeling had progressed further than it had been the last time I'd really looked at it. And in the photograph, there was something else. A thin line of light coming from beneath the sealed area. A line so faint that it might have been a trick of the printing process, a shadow, an artifact of development. But it was there. I pulled out the notebook the next morning. Not to write, I hadn't been able to write coherently in months, but to check the dates. To compare the timeline of photographs to the timeline of events. Its presence became, over time, translations of its intention, living documents of its being, photographs of rooms that didn't exist in normal architecture, in normal time, in normal space. I had become one of those photographs. In the last week of January, I found myself standing in front of the sealed doorway with my hand raised, pressed against the plaster where it had become soft. The surface gave slightly beneath my palm. It was warm. It was breathing, or it was something so close to breathing that the distinction had become academic. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that this was the moment my aunt had been waiting for someone to reach. Not the moment of understanding that the door was sealed to keep something in, but the moment of understanding that the seal was never meant to hold, that some thresholds are not barriers, that some presences do not require doors to move between spaces, that synchronization, once begun, follows its own logic and its own timeline, and that resistance to that timeline simply extends the waiting. But acceptance, real acceptance, not the pretense of acceptance I'd been practicing, but the genuine surrender to the presence of something other within yourself. Acceptance creates the conditions for passage. I removed my hand from the wall. I turned around and walked back down the hallway toward the staircase, toward the rest of the house, toward the rooms where I had been living. And as I walked, I became aware of something moving alongside me. Not a sound, not a presence exactly, but an awareness of another way of being in the space I occupied. A companion in the most literal sense, something that had been learning me the way I had been learning it, something that had decided I was ready, or that I was ready enough. The house has been quiet since that night. I live within it as I lived within it before, except that I am not alone. I have not seen the entity. I have no certainty what form it would take if it were to manifest fully. But it is here, in the spaces between rooms, in the air I breathe, in the way my thoughts sometimes branch in directions I didn't choose, in the photographs that still appear, still documenting rooms that exist in spaces the house doesn't quite contain. I do not know what comes next, but I am no longer waiting for it to come. And that small absence of waiting, that small surrender to whatever is accumulating in this hallway, in these walls, in the spaces that sealed doors create, that is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Because now I understand what my aunt meant when she said that sealing things never works. It was not a warning about the door. It was a warning about what happens when you stop trying to seal yourself against the presence of something that has already made its home inside you. And there is no wall thick enough, no plaster deep enough, no wallpaper strong enough to seal yourself away from something that shares your breath.